Good morning, Highlands Presbyterian. On this Sunday, January 15th, 2023, we're talking about the baptism of Jesus. And you can read about this in the 3rd chapter of Matthew. So last week we talked about Epiphany, and there's this big jump forward, and we have a gap in our scripture about Jesus from really when he was 12. There's a story when he goes to the temple until when he appears and his public ministry begins around the age of 30. And so we're jumping forward along with the text to that when Jesus shows up and is baptized by John the Baptist. And this is the inauguration of his public ministry. So focused on that. And so thinking about my own life, right? There's a lot I don't know about raising children. But there's two important components in our household. The first is obedience. It's important for the kids to be obedient, even when they don't like it. Maybe especially when they don't like it. And so there's obedience. And then the second aspect is the communal experience. We don't have the largest house around, and so we spend a lot of time together. And so we need both of these aspects to work as a family, especially since we spend more time in community. Right, obedience is really important as we're obeying one another to make that a peaceful experience. And so without both of these components, it'd be hard for our family to function well. I mean, if everyone's disobedient, it would be chaos, which it sometimes is. And if we weren't experiencing community, embracing community, we wouldn't be as close as we are. These things both work together. And it's funny to me, it's sort of a little like the Garden of Eden. And by that, I mean, nobody looks at my family and thinks, hey, this is the Garden of Eden. But it's these same two components that make the Garden of Eden work. Right? When Adam and Eve were in the garden, there's this incredible sense of community, of closeness, of intimacy between Adam and Eve, and yet between Adam and Eve and God as well. And it says that God would show up and they would walk in the cool of the evening together. And that community was rooted in obedience. There was one command, not to eat from the fruit of one tree. And so the whole community is anchored in this command. And when they broke the commandment, when they were no longer obedient, chaos ensued and the community was shattered. And we've been plunged in a struggle to get back to that sense of community ever since. Been trying to get back to the garden. So much of the Old Testament is an attempt to recapture what we had in the garden. Life was centered around God then. And when you read through the Old Testament, there's all these ways in which they try to recenter life around God. But we fail in all of these instances. Time after time, there's this attempt to structure things, and sometimes it's a structure in the physical community or the religious community. And time after time, it comes up short. And what happens is the plan is good, but inevitably, in the midst of executing it, something else appealing comes up, and we chase after that, and we pursue this short-term pleasure, thinking that it will be good enough. It's not perfect, but thinking that it's good enough when we settle. And it's usually fine for a little while, but in the long run, over the long term, it inevitably turns up into a disaster because we're settling for something that's not full communion with God. It reminds me a little of, I was listening to the Car Talk podcasts where people would call in with car problems. And somebody called in and they said they had a diesel Suburban and they'd filled it with gas. And then they'd driven a couple hundred miles, and amazingly, it had worked out fine. But now they were saying, what do I do? Can I keep driving it since it's fine? And they said, no, you need to not drive it again, take it to the dealer, have it towed to a dealer. Because basically they'd pushed their luck as far as they could, and disaster was inevitable. And somehow they'd gotten by. But it was only a matter of time before things all went wrong. And this is exactly how sin works. It turns our eyes away from God and puts a close substitute in place. And for a little while, it will be okay. But eventually, this disobedience catches up to us. And we deal with the ramifications of our choices. It's how addiction works. It substitutes something close, but something that falls short of the real thing. And over time, you get hooked on that. For a while, everything seems fine, but that addiction grows, and eventually it takes over life. And this pattern happens repeatedly in the Old Testament. It happens repeatedly in our world today. It happens repeatedly in our own lives. We grasp for something that falls short, for a substitute. And what happens to interrupt this loop in the Old Testament is Jesus shows up. And so the text is the story of the baptism of Jesus and what Jesus does to break the failed attempts to get back to the Garden of Eden, to recapture what we had there. Right? In Genesis and Revelation, Scripture is bookended by these two gardens. And it's here in the Gospels where the pivotal turn is made from the attempt to get back to the Garden of Eden to look forward to the garden in Revelation. If it wasn't for Jesus, we'd still be stuck trying to fight our way back to that Garden of Eden. But because of what he's done, we can look forward in hope, which is good because when we last left the Garden of Eden, it was being guarded by a flaming sword and cherubim. And I don't know about you, but I do not like my odds in that fight. So what does Jesus do? So in summary, Jesus is perfectly obedient, and he pulls us back into community, these same two themes. Another way to say is he balances the law and the gospel. We think about these a lot as Christians, and we tend to divide. We think of the truth of the gospel as we find in the New Testament, ruled by faith and mercy, and then we compare it to the law in the Old Testament, which can be harsh and demanding. And we wonder how to reconcile the two. And what it is it's in Jesus Christ that the two are perfectly reconciled. And we see it in our text today. Jesus is perfectly obedient to the law. And because of his obedience, we're then included in a community that's now defined by grace. And his obedience is transferred to us. People ask why Jesus needed to be baptized by John. If baptism is our entry into the covenant community, it doesn't make sense that he would need to be baptized as he already sits at the center of the perfect community, that Trinitarian community. He isn't baptized necessarily because he needs to be. He does it to demonstrate his complete obedience to God. He never settles. He never falls short. At no point in his life, his ministry, does he ever see a substitute that seems like it would be just good enough and decides to stop there rather than going all the way to do completely what is required by God. We see this in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus is praying, and he says, if there's any other way to do this, let that be done. But if this is the only way, I will do it. And that turns out to be the only way. For 30 years, he made every right choice and always had the long-term best interest of God at the front of his mind. No one else can come close to such obedience. I couldn't make it through an hour with that kind of obedience. We all settle in some way. We reach for an easier path. Jesus never does that. And then he does something remarkable. When he's talking to John, he says, it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness. He's connecting his obedience to the community. It's not just Jesus in a singular I. He's talking in this plural sense about fulfilling righteousness. It's through the community. And this is how Jesus is restoring what was lost at the Garden of Eden. When Adam and Eve sinned, they broke community, and they no longer trusted God, and they no longer trusted each other. What does Adam do? When God shows up and said, why did you eat? He points at Eve. He says, that woman that you gave. There's enmity between Adam and Eve. And we see it Cain and Abel, right? The impacts of broken community, and it's been spilling over generation for generation. But Jesus is bringing people back together through his obedience to the gospel. So the question, right, is what does that mean for us today? And it goes back to what we think of when we talk about family. In our baptisms, we're joined with a community that Jesus is restoring and redeeming in his baptism. And do you think of yourself as part of an eternal community? When you look around the room, do you think about the idea that we're going to be gathered together forever with saints and believers from every time and place? Because that should have an impact on the way we treat one another. Don Salyers, he talks about baptism as far more than celestial fire insurance. It is a specific sacramental act of the church, as well as an ongoing process of becoming disciples of Christ. It refers to the whole inexhaustible meaning of incorporation into a dynamic and continuing reality of Christ, empowerment as his body in the world, and into a life of faith. When we baptize, it's not just a point in time. It's the beginning of a whole new way of life and relating to one another. Baptism is this lifelong process of growing in discipleship. It's only completed at the end of our lives. And so thinking about this entire community of which we are a part, we then think about obedience, right? Because that's how we keep the community together. What are the ways Christ calls us to love and to serve one another? And the beauty of the way that Christ reconciles law and gospel means that we're no longer called to serve because we have to get into heaven. We get to serve one another. We are delighted to serve one another because we're part of this community. It's going to be together forever. And we want others to experience that community. And so we choose to love and serve in grateful response. We see the way that Christ has served us. And so we then try and do that. And it never stops. That's the new loop. Because Christ is about obedience and community, and he's holding that together. And so as a people, brought together by him, in him, through him, we're then called to be obedient to the way he calls us to live, which is based in selfless service. And so I want to leave you with an image. Central Ohio winters, not great. There are always signs of that salt and that brine they use on the roads and in the sidewalks. It's on your shoes. Sometimes it's on the edge of your pants, and it's on your car, and it gets everywhere. Even long after the storm is gone, there's still these reminders of that salt. It's a ceaseless reminder of a storm that once was but no longer is. You see it everywhere, and it reminds you of snow and winter. And so think about that with your baptism, because that's how baptism should be. It's a sign that lingers, that reminds us of the promises that we made to God and to one another. Think about how your life gives evidence to your inclusion in a community based on obedience and grace. How can we have acts of love and service that show to one another the selfless love we have received? And how can that be this ongoing evidence that marks our lives together? It's not just a one-time thing, but it stays and it lingers. And it continually reminds us and one another of the greater truth of the gospel.